Hello, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I'd like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on how to improve creativity as a creative individual. But I decided to do a caveat with this topic to make it a series regarding types. So this first one will just be generally on creativity as a phenomenon. And though I hold the belief that creativity is something of an emergent phenomenon and property, I do think that while at the same time there are innate qualities that depose one person more than other people to be more creative on average, it is a case that there are things that people can do based on the neuroscientific and cognitive scientific literature to enhance the likelihood that they will have a creative breakthrough. If you think of creativity as something like a weather pattern, you can manipulate the whole, I guess, chain of events that would lead to you being more likely to have an insight about this or that. So this first video is going to be generally talking about creativity as a general neural phenomenon as it pertains to any human being really, and not as it has to do with a specific type. So first thing I would like to say is that creativity is something of an uninhibitory phenomenon, whereas deliberation and thought is an inhibitory phenomenon. So to think, and this is why creativity is pretty hard for people to put their finger on in research, because creative exercises, except for creative exercises or creative questionnaires or batteries, I think aside from the one's a test for transient hypofrontality indirectly, which are remote association tasks. And even with remote association tasks, you can solve them analytically, meaning deliberately thinking to try and figure out through process and elimination what the answer to the various questions are. Aside from those, most of the creative thinking testing items are ones where you can deliberately work out a solution to, and many are deliberately working out a solution, especially in the experimental settings, because in most studies on creativity where it involves problem solving, they don't give people time to walk away or to disengage or diffuse from the activity, and so the likelihood that they would actually have a creative insight is decreased just based on the way in which researchers do that experiment, at least in my experience. And whenever I've talked to other artists and writers and things like that about their creative insights and whenever they are most creative, it seems to be the case that what creativity, how it emerges in the first place, what it is from a neurological perspective, is uninhibitory, meaning it's not engaged in some particular critical phenomenon. When I say uninhibitory, I mean, I'm not saying that your prefrontal cortex isn't necessary for certain points of the creative process, but the prefrontal cortex, because of how it is, it's pretty narrowing in your focus and the way in which your attention works in the world. It's mostly goal oriented and it's mostly based on confirmation. So that's part of the issue with the left hemisphere the right hemisphere most precisely, as it pertains to the prefrontal cortex. It's mostly only interested whenever you're going throughout your day in confirming what it already thinks, and it does not like to deal with things that do not already confirm what you think. The issue with this as it pertains to creativity is that creativity has to come from the space of what you don't already know or what you don't already think. That's at least if you're thinking that creativity is about being novel, coming up with novel ideas or being original. So the day-to-day kind of ways in which you are, which is why creative people are a lot more daydreaming and gallivanting with their days. They'll go sit on top of a hill instead of going to work or something like that, because the uh, very action of consistently pursuing goals or being engaged with your world. And even when you're walking around your house, you may not think that, look, your brain is sorting out where the spoon is versus the knife, but it's doing that. And so it's doing that under the level of your conscious awareness, but it's always trying to suss something out in order to know whether or not it fits with its schema, whether or not it helps it get its goals. It's why people, whenever they walk around objects, they can get happy and things like that. You think, why do people care so much about seeing this little trinket or widget over here? Well, it's because underneath it all, there is a conscious, no, excuse me, underneath it all, meaning underneath your conscious processing, there is a aspect of your cognition that is constantly looking at the world and rendering it in terms of um, aids and obstacles. And whenever it sees something that aids it, it gets a little giddy. And so, or it gets a little hit of dopamine. So that's why people are kind of weird like that. But that's actually not great for creativity from a certain standpoint, the actual insight itself, what it takes to get the insight. But I start with the insight itself, because if you're actually trying to be more creative, that means you're trying to come up with more ideas, to be frank. Because let's talk about the negative thing about creativity. Every creative idea is not good. Usually, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're complete ideas, sometimes they're incomplete ideas. Many times, creativity is just a lightning storm. Now, it may differ from person to person. Whenever I can tell you, the creativity I have when I write a song is very different than the creativity I have whenever I write a part of a story, or the scenes in a story. So songs feel like they're dictated to me. Something else is giving them to me. Stories, an image and scenes come into my mind, what I can see and what's going on with the characters and everything like that. That comes into my mind, but that's not, I mean, it's a sudden thing, but it doesn't feel like something's dictating to me. So whenever I write songs, it feels like I understand what people mean by divine inspiration, though I'm not saying this is a divine inspiration or anything like that. It feels like there's something dictating line by line what I'm writing. That's not my active thinking. My active thinking may be looking at what I've put on the page to see if it's accurate to what I know a word's supposed to mean or something like that. But it's not really the thing coming up with a rhyming scheme. It's the same thing with poetry. Something's dictating it. I'm not actually doing it. That's what it feels like. But whenever I write a scene for a novel, I see the entire scene in my mind and what's going on and what's going to be the end and conclusion and point of it. And it's actually, whenever I come up with a story, the whole story from beginning to end is visualized through I'm kind of stuck in a moment just looking in the sky, and people think, well, what the fuck's going on with him? But it's a story, and I can see it from beginning to end, and I can zoom into the various scenes that are supposed to happen with the story. And that's all very image driven. Now, with mathematics, it's completely different. Math, it just, there's, I don't really know what to call it. It's not images and they're not words, they're patterns. And those patterns make themselves very apparent, or they whisper suggestions. So it's a hunch based thing, or it's a here is the answer sort of thing. And sometimes it's just a case that, especially whenever it involves computation, there's just the number. And if you ask me why that's the number, I wouldn't be able to tell you like right then and there from that standpoint, or why that's the solution. Why that has to be the right answer, I have to think about it and reason about it backtracking wise. And that's how the creativity works for me with math, or it's suggestions. And oftentimes that's the one I just described there is the most like visceral, the one that's most shocking to me to experience. But the one that happens most often is suggestions. It says, consider this, 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 consider this. Fast moving train cars of ideas, just fume, 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 fume. Very divergent, not very convergent, very divergent. And it's also something of setting up neighborhoods of impossibilities. I'm not going to go into detail of what that is, but it's the case that but the thing that's true about all of those, I guess, insights is that they usually come at a time. So the suggestion thing with mathematics comes while I'm doing it, but usually it's not while I'm doing it after about 6 hours of doing it. Put it like that. Usually it's while I'm doing it within the first hour or 2 hours when my mind is fresh and I'm not yet frustrated or something like that. And I'm just kind of looking at things. So I'm very prospecting. A lot of times when people, and it's why in my math classes and my physics classes, people kind of looked at me like I was kind of crazy, because a lot of times when people sit down to do math and physics, they zoom in and they're very analytical instantaneously. I'm not saying I'm not analytical instantaneously, but I do just kind of look at it. I don't really do anything with it. I am thinking about it, but I'm not thinking about it directly thinking about it. I'm just kind of mulling things over and allowing things to come to me. And then I start writing things down, but I don't just bam go and hard, cuz interestingly enough, I don't actually like to think about math. So and I don't mean that from a literal standpoint. What I mean is that I'm lazy. So I don't really like to do things the hard way. So I put it like that. I don't do that. And so that's how I do math. And so it looked funny to people, especially on tests, 'cause you're like, you know, because most people put their heads down or they're clearly looking at their paper. I'm just sitting there, occasionally looking at my paper, turning and looking away. My teacher one teacher at one point in time, because I used to look around, like I look around. I'm not looking down always. I look down, I look around, and look down, look around, or something like that. One teacher thought I might be cheating, and I'd explain to them, no, I wasn't cheating. But it looks funny. It looks funny just because I'm an odd duck in the room. I'm an odd duck in the room, and so I guess like when it comes, so specifically, I suppose why I gave that example is because creativity is finite. So it's a lot like or creativity is finite, finite from the standpoint that your ability to be creative diminishes throughout the day based on how much energy you have. Also, it's finite in the sense that it's gradual. So let's talk about why creativity is gradual. And then trust me, this all has to do with the inhibitory aspect of it, because you don't directly, and I guess that was somewhat of a slight indication and example of where I'm going with this, because you can't directly pursue increasing ideation, because that's what you're trying to do whenever you're trying to be creative. And I guess like too, I gave that example because I was talking about the quality of creative ideas. Whenever it's the case, so I guess like this, I'll put it like this. I just woke up maybe an hour ago, so I'm a little scattered, but I'll put it like this. Creativity is like lightning, so it can strike in many different places at various times, and it also has different configurations. So no creative, at least for me, I don't know how it works for other people, but at least for myself, no creative insight has ever been the same as the one that preceded it. Nothing, not even for math. I mean, they all have a general, because I'm analytical and I can notice a pattern, they all have a general, I guess, like makeup, but they're not of the same content. Usually because I'm not solving the same problem or something like that. But even whenever I'm solving the same problem, and I do this so that I build more of the repertoire of the skill innately, but I do wait a certain time period before repeating a problem or an exercise just so that I forget enough of it. Even when I do it, like when I do it specifically like that, I do not have the same exact solution every time. Never, I don't ever take the same train of reasoning, and I guess I do that because I don't want to be bored. And so I do have ADHD. If anybody wants to know, I do have it. So that may be something that's like unique to me, but I mean, I do get bored very easily. So that's why I do it like that, just because my own vanity. But anyways, so But the point of that is to say that creativity is fairly freaking random. So you don't know how much you're going to get. You don't know when it's going to come. You don't know exactly what it takes in order to, I suppose, induce it to emerge, dealing with the, I guess, problems or the goals or items that you're really trying to deal with. So that's the funny thing about creativity. You can't automate it. So it doesn't work like that. And it's why it's inhibitory. You can't think about it. You can't think to be more creative. You can think, and it can, I suppose, influence your neurochemical levels to make it more likely that you'll be dopaminergically prospecting. And that'll make it more the case that you'll have some kind of wacky something to emerge that leads you into a certain direction, but you can't. And maybe, well, so like once, so okay, anyways, but you can't directly say, let's be more creative, and you're more creative. That doesn't work. You can't will your brain to do certain things. Creative emergence is one of them. So with that said, let's talk about how we deal with that. Um, so creativity, first off, in terms of, at least if you can't tell in the way that I was describing it, probably differs per domain. It doesn't differ in how you cause it to manifest itself, but it differs in terms of its expressions based on the personality, most likely. And but at the same time, it's the case that um, well, it differs in its expressions based on the personality to me, because domains are specific in terms of whatever it is you're doing cognitively whenever you're trying to come up with a novel this or that. So coming up with novel mathematics and coming up with novel, I suppose, poetry have a similarity to it from the standpoint that it's all based on the creative process, and it's also the case that the brain is patternistic in its makeup, and so there's all this sort of, I suppose, inhibitory pattern recognition that's going on with it. And perhaps, maybe your poems come to you all in like one go or something like that. Maybe they even have the same structure, but the content, it differs. And most people cannot go from doing, I guess, like 20 years of mathematical research to writing the Iliad. So usually it doesn't work like that. Usually it requires a certain amount of expertise and knowledge of things that have to do with the domain itself. And because there's that, I suppose, prerequisite for a certain amount of knowledge and expertise to the whole idea of being creative in this field or that field, it makes it the case that creativity is domain specific. Maybe perhaps in terms of individuals and the phenomenon itself, it could be all the same thing. Everybody could experience, there could be people who just have it all happen at once for everything, no matter what they're doing. Their creativity is the same, it looks the same no matter what they're doing. I'm just weirdo. It doesn't happen like that for me. So maybe I don't know what that means about me, but in the case, like, maybe it does work like that for other people. Maybe it's the case that, well, I don't know. Anyways, I'm just putting it like that. Like, this is, I just say that it's domain specific. It could be domain specific for multiple reasons, but it's definitely the case that it's more or less definitely domain specific, because there are different prerequisites in every field. So what it takes for you to be creative as a poet, or what it takes for you to be creative as a musician or something like that in a particular field, is going to differ. But it's a specific thing, because your brain, let's talk about the brain and what we have going on with this organ. It's pattern recognition, recognizing fundamentally. And whatever ideation is, it's pattern recognition. And so you're trying to, I suppose, coax your brain through it experiencing and seeing a certain set of patterns consistently enough to synthesize or relate those patterns to a broader pattern that's not evidently apparent whenever you're actively engaging in it in the real time, and so on and so forth. That's why oftentimes whenever people are talking about creative insights, they'll say that slowly it emerged and things like that, because Well, it's what I just described. It's a experience of pattern recognition and pattern synthesis. So it takes some time, and how much time it takes depends on the person and how much expertise you have, which is why, and what patterns you can recognize in the first place has to do a lot with the expertise you have. That has a lot to do, I think, well, I mean, I experience it in different things. So sometimes when I let people read my songs or my poetry, they don't know what I mean. And part of the reason why they don't know what I mean is because they haven't read enough literature, or they haven't read the Bible, or they haven't read enough philosophy. Because I'll combine different images together based on various philosophical, religious, or literary traditions, and they look different, but the only way you would get what they were is if you knew those things. And I'm not saying everything I write is like that, but a lot of times, whenever the metaphors and the images fall deaf, like whenever I have to explain them to people, it's because they haven't read enough. And so that's why, because your brain can't recognize a pattern that it's not already familiar with. And so why creativity isn't something that springs out of the void or the vacuum. Now, I don't want to get into a theological debate or anything like that about, exactly what that means or anything like that. But I can tell you this: there is no ex nihilo. There is nothing from nowhere when it comes to creativity. And it is the case that whether it's coming specifically from nature or whether it's coming from things you're reading or whatever, there you have to familiarize your brain with a certain set of patterns. It's why artists, I don't do this, but I notice a lot of visual artists, they collect images. And the reason why they collect images, they say inspiration, but inspiration is pattern recognition. So, yeah, you have to have a library going on in your mind, because what your brain does is synthesize, or I suppose abstract. And synthesis and abstraction have some kind of relationship, because the reason why I make that distinction is because of whenever you look at an idea, it can be the conglomeration of other ideas, but at the same time, sometimes it's a broader pattern, so it's an extension. It's not something of an aspect of various things coming together, but about something not yet seen. Sometimes you could see something differently by making things, come together, because if you think of ideas as objects, all ideas have different properties per se, and so those properties can inspire you to consider something differently. Other times, like especially with mathematics, it's the case that it's not. So I'll explain it like this. So, for example, whenever you're doing geometry and number theory, as in Euclidean geometry and introductory number theory, so I guess whatever number theory was around since the Greeks and up to the 19th century, whenever you're doing that kind of number theory, like Euler and stuff like that, I mean, some Euler things, some like not go. I mean, it gets complicated. Like trying to make a time period. Look, it's from Greeks to 1800s or something like that. Put it like that. Just whatever you learn in an introductory number theory course, like in college, that number theory, or whatever you would learn in a discrete math class, that number theory, with Euclidean geometry, they may look very different. In fact, whenever you learn to prove things in both of those courses, you learn different methods of proof. Maybe you don't learn different techniques of proof, but you learn different ways to approach various problems in terms of proving them. However, when you study number theory and Euclidean geometry enough, you notice that they're the same in a certain way, and there's something that's deeper than them. And maybe that's where you start stumbling onto groups, or maybe that's when you start stumbling onto categories and everything like that. And so it's abstraction, but it's not synthesizing those things. I put it like that. So, I mean, group theory and category theory are not number theory or geometry, but they tell you or they explain things about number theory or geometry or algebra. And by algebra, I mean what mathematicians consider algebra, abstract algebra. there are various structures that are a part of things that make what you see appear the way that it does, but it's underneath it all. And a lot of times, especially with mathematics, or sometimes with stories, even for myself, sometimes I feel like I'm getting things, especially with philosophy. So I put it like this: philosophy, stories, and math, they have this, the creativity has this feeling of it's something underneath it. So Nietzsche, love that guy, he has this line that under every philosophy is a philosophy. Under every abstraction or idea, I don't know about under every, but I mean, I don't know about that, but from a pragmatic standpoint and the way in which you experience it, usually it feels like there's something underneath something, especially when something seems funny, interesting, or off. So this is what happened with MBTI. I mean, for me, you poke at something and it disappears, or it's just like it crumbles or something like that. It's like uncut. It's like ripping the veil tears or something like that. That's why that metaphor is compelling to people, because it's an aspect of, I guess, experiencing the emergence of an idea. And that kind of creativity, I just call it extension or abstraction. It's not the same thing as a synthesis. It feels distinctly different. I'm pretty sure it can happen with anything, though I think that creativity is more dependent on expertise than the latter. The latter is dependent on expertise from the standpoint, so it depends on what you're doing and what domain you're in. So, for example, why I say that latter depends more, the extension depends more than the synthesis, is because what you can synthesize is multifarious. I suppose what you can pay attention to is multifarious as well. I mean, maybe there aren't clear distinctions from this. I just noticed with my own personal insights and ideation, it's easier for me to do the synthesis thing whenever I don't know as much. But whenever I know more and more and more and more about whatever it is I'm dealing with, the more that extension thing arises in my thinking. And they're very big, broad patterns. And sometimes, and two, it's the case that this happens more consistently than the synthesizing thing that I can notice. So I always see broad patterns, but I can't always articulate them because I'm not necessarily sure what I'm looking at. So that's partly why expertise is very instrumental in creativity for me and perhaps for other people, because I need to know exactly what's going on, because creativity is not, well, so whenever you're dealing with something novel, it's fucking novel, so you don't know what it is. So that's what it feels like. It's new, so I don't know what to say about it or anything like that. I have no language for it or anything like that, and I don't know if there's any other language for it or anything like that. It's kind of like this thing over here, so I'm gonna borrow and use this or something like that. So that's what it's going on. That one seems harder. So seems like it takes more time, to me. And from my experience, it always takes more time with that one. Now, having said that, what is, I guess, the course of action in ethics? Experiences, man. And I'm not really sure about what you want to categorize as experience. So I put it like this: if you want to be more creative as a mathematician, you have to do a lot of math. I mean, you can't have favorites or anything like that. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it just has to, you have to do a lot of math. Now, maybe you don't have to do as much math as other people, who knows? But I'm saying this, like, if you think that, well, you have to do a lot of math. That's it. And the only way you become creative at mathematics is by doing it. So, I mean, you can practice logic and everything like that. You can do other fields that may be related to mathematics, and they'll make it more likely that you're more creative. So let's turn to Bloom's taxonomy to think about this for a second, because I think this is why this will help. This will be a model that will help things make more sense. So in Bloom's taxonomy of learning, you have creativity at the top of the hierarchy. Now, I'm not saying that this is empirically accurate or something like that, but it's just helpful for right now. Now, you have creativity at the top of the hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, you just have memory or recall. trying to remember whatever it is you're dealing or recalling it. This is why it's funny with creativity, because sometimes not remembering something perfectly is what leads to creativity. But for the point of what I mean to say about this aspect of the creative process, we're just going to stick to what we're dealing with right here. If you, for example, are trying to be a musician and you can't recall how to press down the tabs or press the keys or remember the right keys on the piano, or make the chords or the right patterns on the strings or the fret, then sorry, man. Chances are you're not going to do anything very creative. So there is a certain threshold that has to be met of overall basic skill. Then once you have memorization, you have understanding. And what Bloom means by understanding is that you have some more theoretical you have more theoretical, I suppose. You can't define a word with a word in it. You have more of a theoretical acumen about the way in which the parts, I suppose, of an ethical framework fit together. So I call it ethical because you can look at whatever endeavor you do, whether it's mathematics or playing the guitar or something like that, as a series of actions. And so you have to sequence these actions in a particular way for some result to emerge. And maybe you don't know why you're doing certain actions. Maybe you don't know the proper sequence or how you have to sequence them or anything like that. And maybe there are different sequences for different things, but they're just a sequence of actions. And over time, you'll be able to observe yourself and others, if you're around other people while doing this, putting together or reasoning about these sequences of actions. And that will allow you to have a more abstract theoretical understanding of the nature of these actions and their salience to whatever it is you're doing. And so that's understanding. Then once you have understanding, you have analysis. So analysis is interesting because it's not just theoretical understanding. It's actually making sense of the frameworks themselves. So so it's involving logic. So you now can incorporate a certain logic that's particular to this domain with the sequence of actions. And I guess an easy example of this is mathematics. So everybody learns the quadratic formula, right? If you do if you do enough algebra, like if you do algebra, everybody learns the quadratic formula. If you don't, look it up. So you should know it. I'd say just basically you should know that. If you don't know the quadratic formula, for anything you do, to me that's like a bare minimum thing. Everybody should know. That should be a part of education. You should look it up. So everybody knows the quadratic formula. Not everybody can recall it. Once you can recall it, you know what it does. It generally, for various things, it tells you about where a function, because that thing's applicable to more things than just quadratic. A function that happens to be a polynomial or polynomial in form, where that thing has roots on the x-axis or the y-axis, depending on like how you set up the equation or whatever. It tells you where it intersects a particular axis of your interests at a point, which means where the damn thing zero, because the only time something is going to intersect an axis is if the function zero for the y values or the x values. So that's the whole understanding part. The analysis part, I suppose, is this. Whenever you look at the quadratic formula, I don't think about math the same way that other people do. So people would swap the order of these things for me and for themselves. So maybe analysis and understanding comes and whatever. What some people describe as understanding and what some people describe as analysis may differ. But the analysis portion of it for me, you notice that you have a discriminant. And the discriminant can tell you things about the behavior of that function that has more than just things to do with the zeros showing up, but actually how many are going to show up in the nature of those things. And so that has big implications in terms of whenever you're proving things, you're trying to solve problems. And so that's more of the analytic side of it, or that's what I think of the analytic side about the quadratic formula. And then I suppose the creativity is recognizing that you can apply the quadratic formula to more than just polynomials and more than just quadratic equations. So long as they're all trinomial and all of them have the relationship where the power of the third term is half the power of the first term. And if that's true, then fucking you can use the damn thing. So, excuse me, sorry, but you can use it. So that is the creativity as it pertains to the quadratic formula. And if you if you can't gather, man, I've done a lot of math and things like that. So it's the case that I know that about mathematics. Now that works like that for mathematics, but that's a clear, easy example of Bloom's taxonomy. And so that's how creativity has to be approached from a general standpoint, where it's the case that you're actually learning things, you're actually practicing and experimenting with things, and you're watching patterns emerge, and over time you're watching patterns emerge, and over time your mind either synthesizes various patterns or it extends the patterns and sees a broader pattern out of them. And so that's how it works from a general standpoint. Now, you need problems in order to do this. So, I mean, learning in and of itself is a process of solving problems, but as you're learning things, you should try and approach novel problems, whatever it is you're doing, like whether it's music or whatever, it doesn't matter. And I think everybody knows what a novel problem is for themselves. At least I hope you do. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of doing something you haven't done before. Something that's like within the, something that's within the, I guess, neighborhood of things that you're familiar with, but nothing you're actually strictly familiar with. You should do things you have not done before. You have enough of the prerequisite met to approach them, but maybe that's more implicit or tacit in your, I guess, like endeavor, but it's the case that criteria is met, and that's what you're always looking for. You're always looking to solve novel problems after you've learned things, because that's the only time you're going to get to apply your creativity. Like, that's the only time you're going to get a chance to try and be creative, because basically it's doing this. You lick your finger and you point to see where the wind blows, because, well, that's how it works, man. Some days you will be more creative than others, and with some things, depending on expertise and various factors like that and personality, you will be more creative in certain ways than other ways with them. So it's just like luck of the draw. You're rolling the dice here. But nobody said creativity was necessarily profitable. It can be profitable, but it's erratic. It's why businesses' idea of increasing employee creativity and stuff like that is fucking stupid. Like, it is utterly stupid. If people can't tell how much the Western landscape annoys me with its inaneness, there is nothing to me more stupid than corporations trying to, I guess, like, induce creativity. You can make it more likely, or schools or whatever, you can make it more likely that creativity emerges. But, well, it's like 20% days work. Whenever there's nothing to do, nobody's going to demand anything out of you. And it's the case that, you have relatively talented and knowledgeable people in the first place, and they're interested in something that's not having to do with their work, then you'll be likely to get creative things, You'll be more likely. Doesn't mean you necessarily always will, And so long as people, because whenever I naively look at corporations in the Western landscape, I think people are about meeting objectives. I suppose because whenever I worked for places, that's all that they seem to be concerned with, and so that annoyed the shit out of me. And it's also the case that that's very detrimental to creativity, because you can't have an objective with creativity. You just kind of have to see what happens. Like, that's like, you do try and solve problems, like, but you don't actually know what's going to result. You do, I suppose, constrain yourself to whatever it is, but the constraints are embedded within the problems. So at least this is how I do it. So constraints are embedded within problems. A lot of times people say in order to be creative, you have to have constraints. But to me, constraints are embedded within problems. You can't get away from constraints. At least my logical, analytical self works like that. There are, you will walk into that space with constraints. At least for me, I always walk into problems with constraints fully weighing on me because of how I tend to want to approach things, which has something to do with doing the least amount of effort as possible while exerting myself as much as I can in the areas that will, I guess, yield the most profit. that's how that's how I do it. Sometimes that doesn't work, and that's where creativity comes from. And that's usually why I'm creative, because I just can't do it, you know? Or at least I can't do it in the ways in which I understand or have done it previously, with meeting those goals. And I have certain criteria for mathematical solutions. So I don't know if most people have this. A lot of times people just want the proof or something like that. I mean, so fuck that. I mean, I don't care. Look, man, it's not about the answer. It's about the beauty of the thing. So I always want it to be the case that it's aesthetically nice. And so if I have an ugly proof, I don't accept it. And that's because mathematics is not about the truth. So whatever anybody tells you, that's not true. It doesn't mean that all of it's applicable. So maybe it's the case that I don't know if anybody's ever going to be able to do anything with the math that I do unless they're trying to specifically apply it to places. But I know with myself that, I mean, whatever. I'm not trying to be an applied mathematician. Whenever I do math, it's not applied. Unless it's physics. And then that's different. Physics is just applied math. But when it has to, I suppose, to do with even music. So I don't want to write a song that has anything to do with, I suppose, anything I've heard. So that's why I listen to a lot of music. So, I mean, I write psychedelic music and folk music. So I'm already constrained within certain genres. And so, given those constraints and given the fact that I usually want my lyrics to be of differing subject matter and things like that, I want it to be an experience for people, especially when you're dealing with the psychedelic stuff. And like the specific kind of ideas I have is that a song is supposed to be always evolving, and fucking melodies are supposed to die. I hate melodies. It's partly why I hate R&B. So I know people would look at me like, what? And yeah, I did grow up in a house where there was nothing but R&B and soul music, but I fucking hate R&B. Like, I hate it a lot. I do not like R&B whatsoever. That may disappoint people. I will never write a fucking love song. I hate love songs. So, anyways, there are constraints. Trust me, there are constraints. And you'll have them whenever you approach certain problems, because whenever you do approach the problem of, I want to write a new song, it's like, they're from your own personality, your experience, and the criteria you set for yourself, because you need to have metrics with which you use to determine whether this has been successful or not. Whether that's other people liking it or whatever, it depends on what you're doing. I don't know. So those aren't mine. Those are not mine. But it's the case that you have to have some criteria that allows you to say, yeah, check the box. And if you if you have check the box, this works kind of criteria, your own personal taste, you actually have taste, and enough of a knowledge of the landscape of whatever it is, wherever it is, you're approaching the problem, and whenever it is. So in terms of like, I suppose particular financial constraints or like constraints given to you by way of your environment. This is true with painting. Sometimes the paint runs out, and so you can't buy more. So what are you gonna do? It's like, that's how it works. I mean, like, so that's how it works, and you have to, those are your constraints. The environment's going to give them to you, because if you're not a billionaire, I mean, like, they're just going to be there. And if it's the case, too, that you don't want to do things that other people have done, and you have a pretty good amount of technique and knowledge of, what other people have done, and it's the case that you have taste. So you have a personality, and it actually influences what you do in life, and it's not just something of a receptacle of social norms and customs and appreciations, then it's the case that you will have constraints sufficiently there if you try to solve a novel problem. You try to solve a novel problem with respect to yourself, you have all the constraints you can handle. I think, it's like, and I think that's what everybody does. It's just the case that as you grow as a whatever it is you are trying to be, a musician or a mathematician, those problems get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But, it's just, that's the process. And it's the case that you have to make it an indefinite thing. Creativity does not have a time frame. It really doesn't. So sometimes it means you have to repeat a problem over and over and over and over again. This is why a lot of people aren't creative or don't want to be creative, And oftentimes you're going to fail. So why you have to repeat it over and over again is because you don't meet the criteria, or it's not something you can understand. So sometimes that happens with math. I can solve a problem, but I don't actually understand it. So go figure. Like I had the solution with the first solution, but I didn't know enough to know I had the solution with the first solution because it was too broad. It was way too broad for me to know what I was doing. That's just that's how it works for me. Yeah. So there you go. So creativity, it's a lightning storm. You just have to stick up the rod and hope it strikes. That's basically how it works. You can go find where the lightning is going to be, and you can make it more like you do environmental, I guess, engineering to make it the case that the weather system would be more likely to have thunderstorms and things like that, so that lightning would emerge. So you can always be a person that constantly has a thunderstorm going on in yourself. If nobody knows from a psychological standpoint, that's going to require a bit of chaos. You can't be stable, and you can't like stability. That's just not, from being frank, that's why most people can't be creative. You cannot like stability. You have to be willing to take a risk, and you have to also be okay with being crazy. I'm not saying crazy from the standpoint that you're mentally, I guess, unable to function in a normative landscape, but you will be eccentric, and you have to be okay with that, and you have to follow that eccentricity. Joseph Campbell says follow your bliss. If you want to be creative, you better follow your fucking eccentricity. So it's not about bliss, because, from a creative standpoint, because you're weird. If you're interested in creativity and you have ideas, you are weird. You have to embrace it. So, Crosby, Stills, and Nash says, you better let that freak flag fly, man. You better have no discretion about how high you're willing to raise it. Now, sometimes it has consequences, and some creative people are just egotistical and vain, and so sometimes that freak flag flying is not about the process itself, so it doesn't matter. It all gets the job done, I guess, but I'd say that's how you can, I guess, try to induce more ideation in your life from a general standpoint. That's my video. It's rather long. Thank you for watching, and yeah, so again, this will be more specific towards various types later on, so not right now, but there you go. That's my video. Thank you for watching.